So you might remember me from earlier today. I primarily talked about my experience in open source and regulated industries. But since that wasn't hard enough, I decided to take another job 2 years ago when we launched our Brussels-based European chapter of the Linux Foundation Europe. For those of you who don't know, the Linux Foundation is a global non-profit organization dedicated to create the largest shared investment in the world. And it's kind of still interesting that they keep hearing that open source, at times is mentioned as a new kid on the block, well, at least on this block. But as Sachiko, I think, said yesterday, many of us have been here for over 20 years and clearly shows. So let me try to put it in perspective. Probably you know the Linux Foundation because of Linux, but maybe you don't know that it hosts Kubernetes, PyTorch, Node.js, and so many other critical open source projects that power worldwide infrastructure. And if you're not a techie, maybe let me put it in numbers for you. We have over 1,000 projects hosted under the Linux Foundation. We provide governance and funding support and community management, as Keith was mentioning before. We have over 17,000 contributing organizations and over 800,000 developers contributing to the Linux Foundation. 3 million trained developers per year. So this is kind of the size of the community out there. So, I would say pretty impactful. But as we discussed today, this is not just about technology. We talked about industries like automotive, energy, financial services engaging in open source. And not just because it's good for their industry, but because effectively it democratizes their industry, creates opportunity for others to enter, lowers the barriers of entry to economic development in their industry. And so, as an Italian who was transplanted over 10 years ago in California, there's kind of some lessons from both sides of the pond that I hope to share with you. And if I have two, key messages I'd like to share, sorry, I don't have the bell, but I'm going to try to be sort of as lively as I can. One is that open source cannot just be part of Europe's digital strategy. The way I see it is the only way that Europe can achieve its goals of competitiveness and promotion of its democratic values, especially in the year of AI. And two, in order to achieve that, we need a really drastic new approach in terms of funding, but also in terms of active engagement in open source from the public sector. So I want to start from the talk du jour, I guess. I thought we would talk about DeepSeek a little more than we did, so let me touch on it. I think the success of DeepSeek in building a high-performance model for sense on the Euro really demonstrate the promise of open innovation in AI. Most of the news, freaked out about this being a US versus China geopolitical battle, but truly it's a question of open innovation versus closed innovation. And mind you, I'm not using the word open source per se, because DeepSeek is specifically an open weights model, is not open source, and words matter, especially as open source is now codified in regulation. And if you are confused what I'm talking about, I reckon you'll hear quite a bit about it from my good friend Stefano, the ED of OSI, later on, and the panel and esteemed panelists on the AI panel later in the day. But in other words, I think this was mentioned before, DeepSeek brought back the battle of competitiveness from a highly capital-intensive story to a story of ingenuity. From a story where obviously big tech and more entrepreneur-friendly, less regulated jurisdictions will have an inherent advantage, again, to a story of innovation. And so I hope policymakers and everyone else in the room can really see through all the news and the noise this week and see a clear line of sight of what this showed us. Once again, open source can fundamentally reshape markets and democratize them, and therefore geopolitical balances. So particularly in the AI space, which is fairly nascent, or at least changing every day, I think not only Europe has an opportunity to catch up, but establish itself as a leader. After all, Linux, the internet were invented here. As the GitHub friends told us, we have the most contributions from Europe. And most importantly, it can establish itself as a neutral ground. And why not? While US and China are busy fighting each other, rapidly growing in technological relevance. Call me an optimist. I guess what I'm saying, if you think about one of the pillars of the Draghi report that calls for an unprecedented economic investment, particularly in digital innovation, I'm arguing that the only way to turn this investment into desired outcomes is to bet big on open source. So in my mind, the question is not what Europe can do for open source, or what open source can do for Europe, but it's how. How can the EU sustain the ecosystem? So we talked about quite a bit about maintenance, so I will not focus on that. But I think the German Sovereign Tech Agency showed us the way. There's been proposals for EU-level maintenance of open source. And also, just let me add that corporate funding per se is not a bad thing. We talked this morning about Alpha Omega and how much has contributed to the ecosystem in terms of resiliency and maintenance of open source. We published a report last year at the Linux Foundation that shows about $7.7 billion contributions in open source between sweat equity and monetary contribution. So again, the problem is not big tech's contribution of open source. It's that the value extraction out of open source is incredibly disbalanced between the US and Europe. And so why is that? In my mind, it calls for really a different type of investment approach that is based on a deeper understanding of how open source works and open source ecosystem works. First and foremost, even if an open source project most of the funding from the EU that I think about comes in the seed stage of an open source project. And even if the project takes off and commercial companies are built on it, there are very little incentives to create a company here, let alone exit here, due to tax and regulatory environment primarily. We've seen over and over again some amazing European individuals deciding to create their firms in the US, or ultimately pursuing an exit in the US. So I think creating true incentive for companies to grow and exit in Europe is paramount. Secondly, even when public sector funding exists, its outcome in terms of value creation is hardly measurable. This is an area that we're very active on. We're working with a lot of friends here on the NGI Commons project to measure the impacts of funding of NGI. Not only so, but with the Sovereign Tech Agency, we published a toolkit to measure the impacts of public funding on open source software development, and we even launched a working group with our Chaos sub-project just yesterday. So we invite all open source funders and funded developers and projects and other stakeholders to join. After all, you can't fix what you don't measure. Last, but definitely not the least, and this is getting me close to my last point, this seed investment in open source is not matched by the creation of strong commercial open source ecosystems around it that can extract that value and ultimately reinvest it into the open source projects, upstream projects that are used. It's been mentioned today that there is nowhere nearly enough collaboration between the public sector and open source foundations, which provide already a very established vehicle for the private sector to really fund and to really have an open governance between the private sector and individuals, a balanced open governance. So we really hope that we see more of that. So how do we actually foster this new mode of collaboration? First and foremost, I said it this morning, we got to keep open source global. I'll be blunt. I think that with the current regulatory and funding landscape in Europe, it will be very hard to catch up with other regions if we apply a protectionist approach to open source, one that breaks communities in regions or countries. It will force Europe to reinvent the wheel, and this is time that we don't have. It will require recreating the well-oiled machine of corporate funding into open source, leaving the burden again on the public sector and taxpayers' money. And so this is as much a call for people in this room as well as us as foundations. We have to create the right structure for the public sector to, besides engaging bottoms up in community growth, like this weekend we'll all be at FOSDEM, but really in active multi-stakeholder top-down governance of open source projects. That means creating a level playing field where the private sector, the public sector, and individuals can work, fund, and govern open source projects together. I've seen very promising models in FINOS where we have regulators and regulated entities working together, and trust me, regulated entities are receptive because I'll call them regulator success driven. But most recently, I think the Open Wallet Foundation, a project of LF Europe, is really showing the most promising example. We have over 40 governments involved in the project. They recently announced a big partnership with the ITU, which, amongst other things, led to a very, compelling high-level panel in Davos last week to really advance interoperability in an area that is naturally across private sector, public sector, and civil society. So I know it was a lot in a little over 10 minutes. And so I know open source and open source ecosystems are not the easiest thing to grasp, but there are amazing experts in this room and structure that can help jumpstart the path of Europe to success. So I would love to connect with any of you later and discuss more of this. Now, I'm going to put my hoodie on and head to FOSDEM. Thank you.